Elise lifted the brass key ring over her wine glass and smiled at me. Thank you all for giving me Maple House before the wedding. My fingers stopped turning the worn blue carpenter pencil. We were eating beneath beams I had paid to brace. Rita touched Elise's wrist and said my 6 years of work were simply what family does. Frank studied his plate. When I mentioned our equity agreement, he called it symbolic, as though signatures could become decorations when inconvenient. I set the pencil beside the inspection folder. I did not raise my voice. I asked, "Who is handling the closing?" Elise said Nia Walker Tuesday morning and added that the house would secure financing for her luxury event company. The keys clicked in her palm. I looked at the staged transfer packet near Frank's elbow. Is there a buyer deposit involved? And did anyone give Nia my contract? Nobody answered. After dinner, I asked to walk through the house alone before anyone cleared the table. Rita objected that I was being dramatic, which was impressive because I had used 12 words and none of them had an exclamation point. In the front hall, ivory folders sat on the oak console beside a florist's measuring tape and a sample card for wedding linens. The house was not merely being discussed. It had been staged for transfer. I moved from room to room without touching anything that was not mine. The new brass latches, the late gray plaster, the repaired stair rail, each detail carried a receipt in my memory. At the library doorway, I found a small blue pencil mark under the trim. I had made it years earlier to track a crack that widened whenever the west wall shifted. The mark had survived 3 coats of paint because I had left it exposed on purpose. It reminded me that a concealed problem was still a problem, even when everyone admired the finish. Elise followed me into the library, keys tucked around one finger. She said she hoped I would not make the transfer complicated because deposits had been placed and vendors were waiting. I asked which deposits. She said the business lender wanted proof that the house would be hers, and a private buyer had paid good faith money for a narrow strip of shoreline access that Frank intended to separate during the transfer. That was new. I kept my face still and looked toward the lake-facing windows. The shoreline strip had been included in the rehabilitation scope because runoff from it had undermined the foundation. Splitting it without reviewing the drainage work could affect both parcels. Elise waved that away. She had been told it was paperwork. Paperwork held up the west wall, I said. She laughed once, uncertain whether I was joking. I was, slightly. Then I asked who had seen the survey, and she admitted she had only seen a draft closing checklist. Knowledge had shifted. So had my next step. The blue mark beneath the trim took me back 6 years, but only because I needed to decide whether the old promise mattered now. Maple House had been uninsurable after a pipe burst, a retaining wall cracked, and half the electrical system failed inspection. Frank had stood beside me in the gutted library, rolling that same pencil across his knuckles. He had said, "We cannot pay you back quickly, but your work will count." I had answered that affection was not an accounting method. We hired a local attorney then, not Nia, and signed a plain language agreement. My emergency stabilization money would be repaid first if the property was sold or transferred. Beyond that, I held a defined equity share based on documented contributions. Rita signed after complaining that contracts made family feel cold. I said freezing pipes had already handled that. Now Frank called the agreement symbolic. I touched the old pencil mark and decided memory was not evidence. I would verify every line before accusing anyone of erasing me. I photographed the transfer folders from a respectful distance, capturing only their arrangement and dates visible on the cover tabs, not private financial pages. Then I photographed the florist tape, the shoreline survey envelope, and the blue crack mark. I sent myself a time-stamped note describing what Elise had said. It was not proof of ownership, but it preserved the sequence before everyone began revising their recollections. In the kitchen, Frank was loading plates with the concentration of a man diffusing porcelain. I asked him not to move or destroy any house records. He said there was nothing to destroy. Rita told me I was embarrassing the family in my own parents' dining room. It is also the project site, I said. That distinction bothered her more than anger would have. I collected my inspection folder and pencil, thanked them for dinner, and left without taking the keys Elise had placed near my coat. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is inventory. By midnight, I had a records plan. Before sleeping, I sent a preservation email to Rita, Frank, and Elise. I listed records that should remain unchanged: transfer drafts, lender correspondence, surveys, title materials, and messages about Maple House. I did not threaten litigation. I said the ownership terms were disputed and relevant documents needed to be retained during review. Frank replied, "Understood." Elise asked whether I was accusing her of deleting something. I answered that I was asking everyone, including myself, to preserve the record. Rita did not respond. I backed up my photographs and notes, then wrote a timeline beginning with dinner. The work felt absurdly calm beside the betrayal. That was why it helped. Panic makes everything feel equally important. A timeline forces events to stand in order. By dawn, I had separated what I knew from what I feared. The first category could support a boundary. The second could only exhaust me. My restoration office occupied the second floor of a former feed store, with charcoal filing cabinets, warm oak work tables, and a radiator that clicked like it disapproved of modern life. At 7 the next morning, I unlocked the archive cabinet and spread 6 years of Maple House records under the brass task lamp. I began with a neutral question. What could I prove without asking anyone to trust my memory? Each category went into its own stack: bank transfers, permit filings, contractor invoices, inspection reports, insurance correspondence, and the agreement. I made a separate list of facts I did not yet know: whether the agreement had ever been amended, whether the shoreline notice affected transfer, whether Nia had received the document, and whether the buyer could be protected. I did not call Elise. I did not call Rita. Anger wanted an audience. Evidence wanted sequence. By 9, the desk looked like a paper city, and I had located the first foundation beneath it. Every emergency payment had left my account directly. The bank records were unglamorous and therefore useful. There were dated transfers for shoring lumber, mold removal, temporary power, structural engineering, and the first permit bond. None had been labeled gifts. Several included the project code I used for client work, and 2 carried Frank's emailed acknowledgments in the memo chain. I totaled only amounts tied to invoices. I excluded meals, fuel, and the weeks I had slept on a camp cot inside the house, because nobody should be allowed to invoice a family for bad coffee and stubbornness. The documented stabilization sum was large enough to explain why the property had survived, but not large enough to make me a secret owner of everything. That mattered. My agreement had never promised me the whole house. It promised repayment priority and a defined share. A favor has no ledger. Ownership does. I saved a clean index, then printed duplicate packets for myself and an independent reviewer. The next stack would show whether my labor had been formal responsibility or merely helpful presence. I asked my business accountant to verify the transfer totals without interpreting the family agreement. She matched payments to bank records and invoices, flagged 2 duplicates, and identified 1 reimbursement from Frank that I had forgotten. Removing it reduced my claims slightly. I was relieved. A number strengthened by correction was more useful than a larger number defended by pride. I revised the index and attached source references to each line. I also calculated the cost of borrowing against my condominium during stabilization, but placed it separately because the contract did not clearly promise interest reimbursement. The money and sacrifice were real. Still, I would not stretch the agreement to punish people for shrinking it. The accountant signed a sheet describing only her arithmetic. No sweeping opinion, just clean numbers. By lunchtime, the financial chain could be followed by anyone willing to read it, including someone who did not love me. The permit file answered that question with bureaucratic enthusiasm. Every major application named me as responsible project manager. My license number appeared beside the structural scope, electrical coordination, masonry stabilization, and final occupancy review. Inspectors had emailed me correction lists. Contractors had submitted change orders to me. Frank and Rita had approved those roles in writing because the county required a clear, accountable adult. I found the permit for the lake wall and the drainage easement drawing that linked the shoreline strip to the house foundation. Separating that land was possible, but not casual. It required review, updated measurements, and an agreement about maintenance. Elise's paperwork could become someone else's expensive water problem. I called the county records desk and requested an appointment to inspect the property file. The clerk said a rehabilitation notice was indexed under Frank's name and mine. I had not remembered filing one. She could not explain it by phone. That was the first fact that did not fit my assumptions. I wrote it down instead of turning it into a theory. The contractor invoices completed another part of the chain. They showed my approvals, Rita's occasional requests for cheaper finishes, and Frank's signature on the final payment schedule. 3 invoices remained open because the last exterior work had been held until the transfer survey was complete. The contractors had no idea the house might close in 4 days. I called each owner and said the project's ownership arrangements were under review. I did not accuse my family or ask anyone to choose sides. I confirmed the amounts due, requested final lien releases only after payment, and promised an update within 48 hours. One mason, Darnell, said Elise had asked whether his invoice could follow the property after transfer. No, I said. Your work will be paid before anyone treats the house like free collateral. He exhaled hard enough to fuzz the phone. Protecting the crew was not revenge. It was basic project management. I moved enough from my business reserve to cover them temporarily if needed, then scheduled a restrained conversation with Frank at Family Restaurant. In a lower archive drawer, I found my first Maple House project notebook. Its cover was warped from the pipe burst, and several pages still smelled faintly of mildew. The early entries recorded emergency calls, permit deadlines, and the meeting where we signed the agreement. One note read, "Original to Mara, duplicate to Frank, scanned copy to project file." I had written it beside a blue pencil sketch of the west wall crack. That confirmed multiple copies and explained Frank's bank box, but it did not show whether anyone later changed the terms. I scanned the pages and added them as context, not proof of current ownership. Then I checked my fireproof drawer. The ivory sleeve was present, but I did not open it. I wanted certified county information first, so I could compare the private document against the public chain without letting hope choose the answer. Verification was slower than outrage and harder to rewrite. Frank chose a corner booth at the family restaurant, where the vinyl was muted oxblood and the coffee arrived in cups too heavy to steal gracefully. He looked older outside Maple House. I placed no documents on the table at first. I asked one question. Had he or Rita signed anything that revoked or changed our agreement? He said no. Then he added that Elise's lender considered family equity messy, and Rita believed I would eventually let it go. He had allowed a transfer draft that listed only my parents as owners because he hoped we could settle privately afterward. You hoped I would be erased first and paid later, I said. He rubbed his thumb along the cup handle. I thought we could keep peace. Peace, in Frank's vocabulary, often meant the quietest person absorbing the cost. I asked about the rehabilitation notice. His eyes moved toward the window. He said he did not remember the details. That answer was careful rather than confused. I ended breakfast, paid my half, and went to the county archive. After breakfast with Frank, I returned briefly to Maple House. He had given permission by text to inspect the project cabinet, and I saved that message before entering. The title binder had fresh tabs for survey, lender, buyer, insurance, and transfer. The space where our rehabilitation agreement had once been filed was empty. I did not remove or rearrange anything. I photographed the binder closed, then each section without capturing account numbers. A checklist initialed by Elise showed she had reviewed the transfer packet with Rita 2 weeks earlier. Beside existing family agreements, someone had drawn a dash. The omission was deliberate as a drafting choice, though not necessarily proof of unlawful intent. That distinction kept me useful. I locked the cabinet, returned the key, and drove to records room. The blue pencil rolled across the passenger seat at the first turn. I caught it before it reached the brake pedal, the day's least subtle metaphor. The records room was cooler than necessary and smelled of toner, dust, and the faint mineral damp of old stone. A records clerk brought me the Maple House file on a gray cart. I worked through it slowly, checking index numbers against dates. There was the original title record, the rehabilitation loan notice, the drainage map, and a supplemental filing recorded 8 months earlier. The supplemental notice referenced my agreement by date and stated that any sale or transfer remained subject to documented repayment and equity claims. It carried Frank's notarized signature. I read it twice. The filing did not create new rights. It preserved notice of the old ones. It also meant Frank had understood the agreement recently enough to identify it precisely. He had not forgotten. He had anticipated a future dispute and then stood at dinner calling the contract symbolic. I requested certified copies and paid the ordinary fee. Paper does not raise its voice, which is why people forget how loud it can be. In that room, Frank's silence acquired a date stamp. Before leaving records room, I asked the clerk to search for any later release, amendment, or revocation tied to the rehabilitation notice. She checked every owner's name, the property number, and the agreement date. Nothing later appeared. She explained the record-keeping process, not what the documents meant. The certified change showed the original notice, Frank's supplemental filing, and no recorded cancellation. I requested the index page as well as the filings so Nia could see how the search had been performed. At a side table, I compared dates against Elise's lender timeline. Frank had filed the notice 3 weeks after Rita first asked whether Maple House could be transferred without complicating family contributions. The sequence did not prove his motive, but it made forgetfulness impossible. I placed the pages in an ivory envelope. The archive had not solved the conflict. It had narrowed the honest explanations available to the people who created it. The filing reversed the shape of the conflict. Until then, I had believed Rita and Elise had persuaded Frank that our old agreement no longer mattered. The county record showed something worse and more human. He knew it mattered, protected it privately, and still allowed the family to proceed as if I had no claim. That did not make him the mastermind. Elise needed the transfer for her business financing. Rita supplied the moral language that turned my contribution into duty. Frank supplied avoidance, which was the hinge both plans used. I sat at the records table with the blue pencil resting across the certified copy. Months earlier, Frank had quietly made sure my work could not be completely erased. Perhaps guilt had moved his hand, perhaps caution. Either way, he had created evidence and then chosen not to stand beside it. I felt gratitude and anger at once, an untidy combination. Emotional honesty did not require emotional obedience. I added the filing to my index and called Nia Walker's office. Nia returned my call within an hour. Her voice was even, neither warm nor defensive. I introduced myself, said I held a documented interest connected to Maple House, and asked whether she had received the agreement or county notice. She had received neither. Her draft package came from Frank, Rita, Elise's lender, and the survey company. Because the title search was still being updated, the supplemental filing had not yet been incorporated. She asked me to send certified copies, the signed contract, and a concise chronology. She also told me not to assume the scheduled meeting was a completed closing. It was an appointment to review and sign if all conditions were satisfied. That distinction lowered the temperature by several degrees. I asked about the buyer's deposit on the shoreline strip. Nia confirmed it was being held separately and had not been released. She could protect it if the transaction paused, but she needed accurate documentation quickly. I agreed to send a packet by noon. Verification had given me leverage without requiring a single accusation. Back at Restoration Office, I scanned the certified filing and opened the fireproof drawer where I kept original agreements. The Maple House contract was there in an ivory sleeve, signed by all three of us, witnessed, and attached to the contribution schedule. Rita's signature slanted uphill. Frank's was square and slow. Mine carried a smudge of blue graphite near the date because he had handed me the carpenter pencil when my pen failed. The pencil had begun as his promise that my work would count. At dinner, it had become my break, the object I touched instead of saying the first angry thing available. Now the graphite mark tied the original document to an ordinary afternoon none of them could plausibly call ceremonial. I sent Nia a digital copy, then arranged insured delivery of a duplicate. I included no editorial language. Dates, amounts, permits, filing numbers, and open invoices did the work. By early afternoon, Nia confirmed receipt and postponed signature preparation pending review. The transfer had not stopped yet, but it could no longer pretend I was absent. Rita arrived at my office without an appointment. She wore her ivory coat and the expression she reserved for service counters and family insubordination. I kept the glass conference room door open and asked my assistant to remain nearby. Rita said Elise had already announced Maple House as the address for her wedding business launch. If I delayed the closing, vendors could lose money and relatives would ask questions. She said I had always been the capable daughter, while Elise needed one clean start. I asked whether my start had been considered clean when I borrowed against my condominium to stabilize their house. Rita said I had chosen to help. Yes, I said, and you chose to sign the terms. She called the contract cold. I told her temperature was not a legal category and immediately regretted how much I enjoyed the line. Then I explained my boundary. I would not interfere with the wedding, publish family messages, or demand more than the agreement. I would also not withdraw. She left with her coat buttoned wrong. That evening, Elise emailed me directly. The subject line said we should solve this as sisters. The message beneath it was less sisterly. She argued that I already had a career and a condominium, while she had spent years building a brand. Maple House, she wrote, was the one asset our parents could give her without dividing it into technical shares. Halfway down, she referred to the old repayment agreement Dad filed last winter and said everyone understood it was only protection in case an outside buyer appeared. There it was. Proof she knew both the contract and the recent filing existed before dinner. I saved the original email, exported it with metadata, and forwarded a copy to Nia. I did not reply that night. The email did not prove fraud or some dramatic conspiracy. It proved knowledge. Elise had not innocently accepted a gift from parents who forgot an old document. She had decided my interest became technical when it blocked her plans. That was enough to change how I spoke to her next. Nia completed her preliminary review the next morning and asked me to meet at closing suite. She had compared the contract, county notice, title record, and transfer draft. Her conclusion was plain. The package could not be signed as written because it omitted a documented repayment priority and equity interest. The shoreline sale also needed updated treatment of the drainage obligation. She did not congratulate me. Good attorneys rarely behave like game show hosts. She asked what outcome I wanted. I said I wanted the buyer protected, the contractors paid, and my agreement honored. I was open to a fair purchase, sale, or mediated settlement. I was not seeking ownership of shares that belonged to my parents. Nia nodded and said that clarity would matter. The family could correct the documents voluntarily or enter a formal dispute where costs would rise and relationships would harden. The main reversal was complete. The house was not about to vanish from under me. The question had become whether my family would acknowledge reality without being forced through the most expensive door. I paid the 3 remaining contractors from the project reserve and obtained conditional releases stating they would become final when the family settlement reimbursed the account. It reduced my cash cushion at the worst possible moment, but it prevented workers from carrying the cost of our conflict. Darnell met me at Maple House to inspect the lake wall. We kept the visit technical. The shoreline survey stakes were too close to the drainage channel, exactly as I had suspected. He photographed the outlet and measured the retaining cap, while I checked the old blue pencil mark inside. The crack had not widened. That small fact felt almost insulting in its calmness. The structure was stable, while the ownership around it shifted. I sent Nia the drainage note and recommended that the buyer's parcel be redrawn or the maintenance obligation be documented clearly. She forwarded it to the survey company. An innocent buyer should not inherit a family argument disguised as a boundary line. My counter-move would be accurate, or it would not be mine. Frank came to Maple House while I was finishing the inspection. He stood in the library, looking at the pencil mark beneath the trim. "I filed the notice because your mother started talking about giving Elise the house," he said. I asked why he had not told me. He said he hoped the filing would force everyone to be fair, without requiring him to confront Rita. When Elise's lender pushed for speed, he told himself the closing attorney would find it. He had built a trap door for his conscience and expected a stranger to open it. I told him the filing helped, but it did not erase his choice at dinner. He agreed. No speech followed. He handed me a key to a bank box containing his duplicate contract and old project correspondence. I did not take the key. I asked him to retrieve the materials himself and deliver copies to Nia. Repair required effort from the person who had caused damage. He closed his fingers around the key and said he would do it that afternoon. The independent appraiser arrived at Maple House 2 days later. Rita wanted a family friend who sold lake properties, and Elise preferred a valuation prepared for her lender. I declined both. Nia provided a list of neutral professionals, and we selected one by mutual written agreement. I walked the appraiser through the restoration scope without discussing the family dispute. I showed structural upgrades, mechanical systems, drainage work, and remaining maintenance. Rita followed us with a folder of comparable homes. Elise emphasized the house's wedding business potential. The appraiser reminded her that a residence was not automatically valued as an event venue merely because someone owned attractive napkins. I had to look at the floor. The blue pencil stayed in my pocket until we reached the library. I used it to point out the preserved crack mark and explain the repaired load path behind the trim. The motif had become practical evidence again, not sentiment, but a visible record of defect, method, and successful stabilization. Elise asked me to meet at Family Restaurant after the appraisal. She arrived polished, late gray suit immaculate, but without the keyring. That absence was the first concession she had made. She explained that her luxury event business had strong bookings but weak collateral. The house would secure a line of credit, provide a showroom, and reassure vendors. Our parents had promised it after her previous partnership dissolved. She believed I was safe because I had a steady career. She believed she was owed a rescue because her risk looked more glamorous than mine. I asked whether she had told her lender about my contract. She said the lender had advised clearing family claims at closing. "So you knew I had to be cleared," I said, "but you did not invite me." Her eyes tightened. She said she expected Rita to persuade me. There was the focused plan, finally stated without theatrical confession. Speed, family pressure, and documents drafted around my absence. Believable, efficient, and wrong. I told Elise I would not destroy her business plan, contact her vendors, or threaten her wedding. I also would not convert 6 years of documented work into a blessing she could spend. She asked whether I wanted to punish her by taking Maple House. No, I said. I want a result that remains fair after everyone stops calling it family. That was the boundary I had been approaching since dinner. Fairness was not softness. It was a boundary with measurements. I offered 3 paths: sell the house openly and divide proceeds according to the agreement, let Elise buy out my documented interest at an independent value while resolving the debt, or let me purchase my parents' remaining share under the same appraisal. Any path had to protect the buyer deposit, pay project costs, and account for the shoreline issue. Elise said she could not qualify if my interest remained. I answered that financing built on erasing another owner was not financing she could safely afford. She left before the coffee cooled. Nia's full review took 3 business days. She built a chronology from the signed agreement, bank transfers, permits, contractor invoices, the county notice, Elise's email, the shoreline deposit, and the draft transfer package. She marked every point that was documented and every point that remained disputed. The contract's repayment formula was clear. My equity percentage was fixed, not expandable based on emotional labor. The county notice made the interest visible to later parties. The parents still held the majority share. The shoreline buyer could withdraw and receive the full deposit if the revised arrangement was not acceptable. Nia warned me that a formal dispute could freeze the property, consume money, and expose all of us to uncertainty. She also said the draft transfer could not simply be signed over my objection. I appreciated the lack of triumph. Ordinary systems rarely deliver perfect justice. They create lanes in which people must choose. I authorized Nia to share my settlement options and supporting index with all signers. The shoreline buyer joined a conference call through separate counsel. I never met him in person and did not need to. He had relied on a survey and paid a good faith deposit. He wanted either a corrected parcel with documented drainage access or his money back. Rita initially argued that returning the deposit would make the family look unreliable. I said keeping it while withholding a material problem would make us unreliable. Nia arranged for the funds to remain untouched while the survey company revised the map. The buyer chose to wait 5 days. That cost him time, so I agreed that any extension fee would come from the eventual transaction proceeds, not his deposit. Protecting him narrowed Rita's favorite argument that my objection harmed innocent people. It also cost me leverage because a failed side sale would reduce funds available for settlement. I accepted that. A countermove that required someone else to absorb hidden damage would reproduce the same behavior I was resisting. Frank delivered his bank box copies to Nia as promised. Among them was an email chain from 8 months earlier. Rita had written that Elise deserved the house because I already had the value of it in experience. Frank replied that experience did not repay cash and reminded her of the agreement. 2 days later, he filed the supplemental notice. Then the chain stopped. He had never sent the final message he drafted to both daughters. In it, he stated that no transfer should occur without my written participation. The unsent draft proved no external fact, but it showed exactly where he had abandoned action. Frank called me after Nia reviewed the packet. He said he was ashamed. "I believe you," I told him. "Shame is not repair." He asked what repair looked like. I said, "Tell the truth in the closing room, pay his share of the contractor reimbursement, and stop asking me to manage Rita's reaction." Trust returned like restored wood, by removing rot, not painting over it. He said he understood. Rita invited me to Maple House alone. I went because the appraisal was pending, and because avoiding every difficult conversation could become its own form of control. I kept Nia informed and limited the meeting to 30 minutes. Rita stood in the kitchen where I had once washed plaster dust from dinner plates. She said she had counted on me being generous. I asked why generosity always traveled from me toward Elise and never the other direction. She said a lease was more fragile. I said fragility could explain support, not ownership of my contribution. Rita began listing every parental sacrifice since college. I stopped her gently. We were not auditing childhood. Love that requires amnesia is only management. She looked as though I had closed a door. In truth, I had labeled one. I told her contact with me would depend on whether she could discuss the house without redefining signed facts. She said contracts had changed me. I said the contract had revealed what she expected me to surrender. The appraisal arrived in a sealed digital report and a matching paper copy at closing suite. The value was lower than Elise's lender projection and higher than Rita's preferred family figure. In other words, it was probably useful. Nia calculated each option under the contract. If the house sold, my documented stabilization money would be repaid first, open project costs next, then the remaining value divided by the agreed equity percentages. If either sister purchased the parent's majority share, the same credits applied against the independent value. The shoreline strip, if sold, would carry its own drainage terms and proceeds allocation. Elise could not secure enough financing after accounting for my interest. Her business plan depended on receiving the house nearly free and borrowing against the full value. That was not a moral failure by itself. The moral failure was treating my erasure as an operating assumption. I studied the figures overnight. They showed I could purchase the remaining family share, but only by selling my condominium and taking a manageable loan. My condominium was not a secret fortune. It was a compact 2-bedroom above a pharmacy, purchased 12 years earlier and refinanced when Maple House needed emergency work. Selling it would give me a down payment, not a carefree life. The new loan payment would be higher, and Maple House still needed annual maintenance no appraiser could flatter away. I met with my bank using ordinary documents: income history, business accounts, appraisal, contract credits, and proposed settlement terms. The loan officer did not care about family betrayal. She cared about debt ratios and insurance. That was refreshing. I qualified conditionally if the shoreline issue was resolved and the contractor reserve reimbursed at closing. I requested no special favor. I also prepared for the possibility that my offer would fail and the house would be sold openly. Choosing Maple House was not about winning a trophy. It was about deciding whether I wanted my future tied to the work after my family's claim on it had been measured and released. I did. Before the scheduled closing meeting, Nia circulated a revised agenda. No transfer would be signed on the old draft. We would confirm the documents, hear each party's preferred lawful option, and determine whether formal mediation could produce a settlement. The buyer's revised shoreline map would be handled separately. I assembled one slim folder rather than carrying every box. Inside were the signed contract, certified notice, appraisal summary, payment index, permit list, contractor releases, financing letter, and my written offer. The worn blue pencil rested in the spine. I practiced saying 3 sentences. I would accept the contract's limits. I would protect third parties. I would not consent to a transfer that omitted me. That was enough. Over-explaining had been my family role for years, providing extra reasons until everyone found one weak enough to debate. This time, the documents carried the detail. My choice carried the conclusion. On Tuesday morning, I entered closing suite 10 minutes early and sat facing the window, not the door. Closing suite had ivory walls, a charcoal carpet, and a polished oak table long enough to make relatives look like separate delegations. Nia placed document packets at each seat. I set my folder down but kept the pencil in my hand. Rita arrived first, rigid in muted oxblood. Frank followed with no attempt at conversation. Elise came last, wearing the late gray suit from the appraisal and carrying the brass keys she had displayed at dinner. She did not place them on the table. Nia explained that the meeting was not a trial, and she represented the integrity of the closing process, not any family faction. She would identify what could and could not be signed, then invite lawful settlement choices. Rita asked whether all that was necessary when the family had already agreed. Nia looked at the 5 signature lines required across the proposed transactions. "The family has not all agreed," she said. I placed the blue pencil beside my contract folder. Its small click against the oak sounded exact. Rita began before Nia could open the first packet. She said family promises were not business, and that delaying Elise's future over old receipts was cruel. She asked Frank to confirm that the house had always been intended for both daughters in different ways. Frank did not rescue her. He said the written agreement was real. He had filed the notice, and he should have stopped the draft transfer earlier. Rita stared at him as though honesty were an affair he had confessed. Elise said the filing was only precautionary. I slid her email into the shared packet without commentary. Nia confirmed the message showed prior knowledge of the agreement and notice. It did not decide motive, but it removed any claim that the omission was accidental ignorance. I felt no surge of victory. The people across from me were still my family, and the facts made them smaller, not monstrous. Focused choices had brought us there. Rita's entitlement, Elise's speed, Frank's avoidance. My task was not to destroy them. It was to stop paying for those choices. Nia read the relevant provisions aloud in plain language. Upon sale or transfer, my verified stabilization funds were repaid before distribution. My equity percentage then applied to the remaining net value. Any transfer had to acknowledge that interest or settle it by written agreement. The county notice alerted later parties that the claim existed. She placed the certified filing beside the original contract. The graphite smudge near my signature matched nothing legally important, but my blue pencil lay beside it like a quiet witness to the day Frank promised the work would count. Nia then addressed the shoreline deposit. The revised survey protected drainage access, and the buyer could proceed or withdraw without penalty. No one could use his money to bridge our disagreement. Finally, she said the draft transfer to Elise could not close as written. She asked each signer to choose between a lawful appraisal-based settlement, an open sale, or a formal dispute. There was no miracle in her words. She had followed the documents everyone else had hoped would remain scattered. Elise stared at the keys in her hand. For the first time, she seemed to understand that the gift she had celebrated depended on converting my money, license, and labor into family atmosphere. She asked whether I had planned all along to take the house. I reminded her that I had offered her the first opportunity to buy my interest at the same independent value. She could not finance it. That was painful, but it was not theft. Rita said I was choosing a building over my sister. I answered that they had chosen Elise's business plan over my documented ownership before I entered the room. Frank asked Nia whether my purchase offer was valid under the appraisal. Nia said it was, subject to financing and agreed credits. He said he would accept it. Rita looked at Elise. Elise's face changed from anger to calculation, then grief. She had built a future around a promise our parents did not fully own. I could recognize that loss without becoming responsible for funding it. Nia asked for my choice. I could force an open sale, pursue formal claims for delay costs, or keep the offer I had made before seeing everyone's position collapse. I chose the fair settlement. My parents would receive the independent appraised value for their remaining share, reduced by my documented equity, repayment priority, reimbursable contractor costs, and ordinary closing adjustments. The shoreline sale would proceed only with the corrected drainage agreement. Elise would receive nothing from Maple House because she had never owned a share, but I would not seek damages from her business or interfere with her wedding. Rita called that outcome merciless. I asked Nia to read the numbers again. They showed my parents receiving substantial value, the buyer receiving what he paid for, every contractor being paid, and me assuming the loan and maintenance. Mercy is not the same as pretending the ledger is blank, I said. Elise set the brass keys on the table. This time, they were not a trophy. They were property awaiting a lawful owner. We did not sign everything that day. Ordinary fairness required more work. Nia scheduled formal mediation. The bank completed underwriting. The survey company recorded the drainage terms, and each party had time to obtain independent advice. At mediation, Rita argued for a higher value based on hypothetical event income. The neutral appraiser explained again that unapproved commercial use was not guaranteed value. Elise asked for reimbursement of wedding deposits tied to the house. I agreed to let her hold the ceremony there under a short written use agreement if she covered insurance and cleanup, but she declined. She said it would feel like borrowing my life. That sentence was closer to understanding than an apology. The final settlement matched the appraisal formula. Frank paid his share of the contractor reimbursement immediately. Rita signed after 2 long breaks. Elise signed an acknowledgement that she held no property interest and released the keys. No sudden confession repaired us. The documents ended the dispute. Our choices afterward would determine the relationships. When the purchase closed 6 weeks later, I unlocked Maple House alone. The room smelled of oak wax, cold stone, and the faint lake mineral that entered whenever the west windows opened. I carried 1 suitcase, 2 archive boxes, and the blue pencil. I did not celebrate by changing every room. That would have made the house another argument. I moved my work table into the library and hung the original drainage plan near the concealed crack. The brass keys went into a shallow bowl by the door. Rita did not visit. Elise sent a brief message asking when her stored event samples could be collected. I gave her 3 appointment windows and had a neutral mover present. Nothing was damaged, no scene was made, and she left with every item. Frank came the following weekend to repair a sticking pantry door. I paid for the materials and let him work without calling it reconciliation. Actions could begin a bridge. They could not declare it finished. Owning Maple House changed my practical life before it changed my emotions. I sold the condominium, adjusted my business budget, and learned exactly how much a lake-facing roof resented modest income. I also converted the former carriage room into a small training shop with safe benches, tool storage, and proper ventilation. For years, adult women entering restoration trades had asked whether they were too old to start. I understood the question. Capability is often welcomed only after it becomes useful to someone else. I designed a paid weekend apprenticeship. 6 participants, 2 instructors, real repair exercises, and wages rather than inspirational tote bags. The first project would be a measured plan for restoring a damaged window sash. I used part of the shoreline proceeds allocated to my share to fund materials and safety equipment. The house had stopped being proof that I belonged to them. It became infrastructure for the life I chose. That distinction was quieter than revenge and much more expensive, but it held. 8 months after the dinner, 6 women stood around the carriage room benches in work clothes, comparing mortise cuts and laughing at a hinge that had defeated 3 generations of homeowners. Maple House was warm with task lights and coffee, not staged linens. The first apprentice, Sonia, was 46 and had spent 20 years managing medical records. Her completed window plan was precise, practical, and covered in erased blue lines. She apologized for the corrections. "Corrections are the plan becoming honest," I told her. At lunch, we carried soup into the restored library. I showed the group the small pencil mark beneath the trim and explained how it had tracked a structural crack. I did not tell them the entire family story. The mark no longer belonged only to betrayal. It represented observation, the discipline of noticing what a polished surface tried to hide. The apprenticeship fees covered the instructors and part of the house payment. Better life, I had learned, could be both meaningful and properly invoiced. My contact with Rita and Elise remained limited and conditional. Rita sent holiday cards addressed to the family home, so I returned the first one with the correct address label and ignored the second. Eventually, she asked whether we could meet without discussing ownership. We managed 40 minutes at Family Restaurant and left before old language turned into new damage. Elise rebuilt her event company on a smaller scale, renting venues instead of borrowing against Maple House. She never offered a complete apology. She did send the survey company an organized file of vendor measurements that helped with the shoreline closing. I thanked her for the useful action and nothing more. Frank kept repairing trust in similarly uncinematic ways. He attended 2 counseling sessions with Rita, forwarded every property-related message without editing it, and showed up for apprenticeship weekends to sharpen tools. I watched patterns, not speeches. Boundaries did not make the family warm. They made contact measurable enough that I no longer disappeared inside it. After the first apprenticeship weekend, I framed Sonia's completed window plan in the library. Beside it, I mounted the worn blue carpenter pencil in a narrow brass clip. The pencil had once carried Frank's promise, then marked a hidden crack, then steadied my hand at dinner and rested beside the contract that stopped the transfer. Now it pointed towards someone else's beginning. I stood back and noticed the frame was slightly crooked. That felt appropriate. Restoration was not the art of pretending damage had never happened. It was the work of making the structure honest enough to carry weight again. Maple House was mine, but the greater change was simpler. My contribution no longer required family agreement to be real. I had the records, the boundary, the loan payment, the apprentices, and a table where nobody received a future by erasing mine. If you would like another original story about a quiet boundary and an earned countermove, listen to the next one from The Last Quiet Word.